Emily, it's taken time for a clear picture to emerge, not least because most people voted early, and those ballots, many postal as you were just discussing, have to be counted. Here is the state of play as we go on air. Some networks have projected Arizona, Wisconsin and Michigan for Biden. We're being a bit more cautious. One thing is clear, though. This has been a historic result in terms of turnout, with both sides highly motivated. The US looks set to get a 67% turnout with 136 million votes cast as of 5 o'clock this afternoon. Joe Biden has topped 70 million votes, the largest number of any candidate in US electoral history. Even so, Donald Trump has got 3 million more votes than he did 4 years ago. But, of course, the popular vote doesn't matter. It all comes down to the Electoral College. And let's look at where we are now with that. The Biden campaign says they're very confident of victory in Wisconsin, Arizona and Michigan. That would give Biden 264 electoral votes. And Fox News agrees with that. Tantalizingly close, but not quite the 270 that Biden needs to be president. The key will be for him to tip a state like Georgia, Pennsylvania, or perhaps the most likely next, Nevada. And it could be just a while before there's a clear answer in those states. One thing, though, is apparent, that despite the popular vote mandate, this won't be a landslide for Biden. The polls certainly underestimated Trump's support, which in absolute terms grew during the last 4 years. So where did that happen? Voting is complete in North Carolina, Florida and Georgia. And they're all interesting results from there. Almost majorities Hispanic neighborhoods voted for Trump, up 11%. In majority black neighborhoods in those states, up 2%. And look at this, it was meant to be Biden's sweet spot, but even the over 65s down there, Biden was up just by 1.5% with them. One caveat, though, to those figures, they could look different when we get the bigger national picture in the days and weeks ahead. Well, if Biden is to govern effectively, control of the Senate would certainly help, but that may elude him, with Senator Susan Collins in Maine, a Republican Trump skeptic, doing better than expected there, and the Republicans likely to hang on to North Carolina and Georgia as well, taking them potentially to 50 Senate seats. That would split the chamber right down the middle, symbolising a polarised nation. So a record turnout, but what drove people to the polls? According to the exit polls released last night, this wasn't the coronavirus election that many people thought it would be. 35% said it was the economy that caused them to vote, 20% racial equality, and down at third with just 17%, the coronavirus pandemic. Perhaps that's one reason that the rout of President Trump and his party, predicted by many polls, didn't happen.
Thanks, Mark. Absolutely fascinating, some of that data. We're going to dive into it a bit further. Joining us now, Goldie Taylor, who's worked for political candidates on both sides, now editor-at-large of the Daily Beast, and Frank Lunz, the Republican pollster and strategy. And Goldie, I just want to start with those numbers for Donald Trump, because he increased his share of the vote. I wonder how you explain that to your readers, to people who understand that he has done better in 2020 than he has in 2016.
He certainly has, and I think almost no one, I don't know a pollster who is credible who predicted that Donald Trump would expand his electorate in the way that he had. You know, certainly he got a greater share of white voters than he had in 2016, but he also got a greater share of Hispanic and Latino voters. He got a greater share of, not much marginally so, but a greater share of African-American voters. And I think that there is a sort of riding thought as to why that happened. Number one, I think there was a misstep, if you will, by the Biden campaign in terms of investing in or shoring up votes among Hispanic and Latino voters, especially in South Florida and the southern, southwestern corridors of Texas, especially. And so those states where he might have done better, there were fewer resources, but where he did make the investments, where he is making up the gap, and where you're seeing some of those states come in his column tonight even, was among African-American voters. We knew that if we could grow that vote, if we could encourage more excitement, sow more excitement among that vote,
Goldie,
it would show up.
Let me ask you about that. I'm really interested in when you say shoring up the Latino vote, particularly in Miami-Dade. I mean, some people will say it's because it was sort of, sold to people of Cuban origins, of Venezuelan origins, that Biden was a socialist, and that was obviously what they had escaped from. Others will say, I've heard this phrase, hispandering, that there was something in the Biden camp that was sort of, taking the Latino vote a little bit too sort of lightly, playing Despacito at the rally and hoping that everyone was sort of, homogenized and would go for the Democrat vote. Where do you think that actually went wrong?
Well, I think they're both right. I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. I think on the one hand that there were folks inside the Biden camp who did not invest more fully in Hispanic and Latino voters. But I think also that there were other aspects at play that are intercultural. And so, Cubans certainly in South Florida, operate a bit differently than, say, those of Mexican heritage who line the southwestern quarter of Texas. Those are places where Biden lost. In fact, in the Rio Grande Valley, he lost in spades among Hispanic voters among that quarter in the Rio Grande. But I think that there are a couple of things at play. Number one, the socialist boogeyman. Anybody who knows Joe Biden knows that he runs in the same stripe as, say, a Barack Obama, even a Bill Clinton, that he is much more centrist than maybe even progressives wanted to put forth this time. And so the socialist boogeyman really did play this time. And so Venezuelans, Cubans and such did.
Let me bring in Frank Lunz now. I want to look at what's happened to the Trump vote, Frank, because it seems as if he's increased fractionally his vote amongst white women. Now, we'll remember 2018, the midterms, was all about getting back suburban women. I'm wondering if that has now sort of reversed.
Well, he lost them earlier in the campaign when he was so eager to get the kids back to the schools. And what we found was in that period in late August, early September, suburban white women with children, moms, were uncomfortable sending their kids back to school. They wanted to work, but they still were nervous about it. And 51% of these women were either extremely or very afraid of their children attending class with other children. And the fact that Trump seemed to be pushing them to go created this schism that it took until the last week of the campaign to repair itself. And second, even though Trump's job approval went higher among women over the last year, his performance in that first debate really turned these middle-aged, middle-income moms against him. They didn't like the way that he interrupted. They didn't like the way he carried himself. And for them, it's not just about policy. It's also about the persona, about the character of the candidate. And they really disliked and resented how tough Trump was. He fixed it to a great degree in the second debate, but these are all contributors to what was happening.
But Frank, let me ask you, because presumably you're speaking to people in the Trump campaign now, and by the looks of it, they wouldn't have expected to have done this well or to have come this close, would they? Isn't this considered a better result than they were anticipating?
It's a better result than anybody else was anticipating, but the Trump campaign would tell you that they've been reading this and seeing this all along. And that's one of the problems, actually. One of the reasons why I now realize that if Donald Trump had made a couple different decisions during the campaign, he would be the one who'd be ahead tonight. He'd be the one that we'd be assuming running for president. If he had changed his debate strategy, and by the way, he went to the right states and had the right messages in those states. But if he'd showed just a little bit of empathy, particularly in coming out of Walter Reed, this could have been a different outcome. I didn't realize personally, as a pollster, I didn't realize how close this election was going to be. Donald Trump absolutely could have won it.
Isn't that an extraordinary thing to say, though, Goldie? I mean, if we've learned one thing, again, 4 years on, it's how confusing the picture that the pollsters painted for us has been. And the sense you get is maybe polling is only actually reaching half of America. I mean, there's a whole swathe of America that is not saying what they're doing and not trusting anyone with their vote or their news that they're getting.
Well, first of all, I have to say that I agree with Frank Lunz wholeheartedly on his previous spate of statements. I think that, that this race could have been largely in Trump's favor had he made a few different decisions. But certainly, I think polling has its weaknesses, but it always has. There was a fellow named Bill Bradley in California who ran for office, and he was black then, happens to be. And when they called pollsters to ask about him, 30 years ago, about Bill Bradley, would they vote for him? There were many white voters who said they would, when in fact they wouldn't. When in fact they weren't favoring him because they didn't want to tell people that they weren't favoring him because he happened to be a black candidate. This time it sort of worked in reverse. We call it sort of a reverse Bradley. There were a grand swath of people out there who did not want to admit, because of either public derision or other things, that they were supporting Donald Trump and that they liked his policies, that they liked what he was doing at the border, that they liked what he was doing in terms of the Supreme Court and, anti-reproductive rights laws, that they liked what he was doing in terms of taxation, that they liked what he was doing in terms of, dealing with protesters on the streets. They liked the kind of language and verbiage that he was putting forth. And so there were lots of folks, when I know them, who said, gosh, I just think he's a bad guy. But they went into the voting booth and they voted for him anyway.
Right.
That means they tell the
right. It's fascinating. Frank, very briefly.
We've got the numbers behind that. 19% of Trump voters were dishonest with their friends and even their family. Only 9% of Biden voters acted the same way. There was a level of either embarrassment or fear of how they were going to be treated, retribution if they acknowledged they were voting for Trump. That was one of the impact of the polls. But the second is that Trump people did not participate. They simply refused to cooperate with pollsters. And the reason why? They did not want to help the establishment. They didn't want to help CNN or the New York Times. And so they simply said, no mas, I'm not going to be involved. The only way that pollsters will ever be able to measure them is by asking longer questions and by empowering these people, telling them that if you speak to us, the world is going to hear you. They're going to respect you. They're going to recognize you. It actually requires a different questionnaire than what we normally would do with voters. And those are the two reasons why.
I think that's absolutely fascinating.
Absolutely.
Thank you both very much indeed. Really, really good to have you on Newsnight this evening.